Please. I counted it twice. It should be enough. The coin slipped from Olivia Hayes' trembling fingers and scattered across the checkout counter. A sharp metallic clatter that seemed far too loud for the small convenience store, instantly drawing every pair of eyes in line toward her, as if she had just announced her desperation out loud, instead of trying to keep it contained behind a whisper. And for a moment she froze, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, staring down at the uneven pile of quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies like they might somehow rearrange themselves into a different number if she just waited long enough. Like maybe exhaustion had made her miscount. Like maybe reality would be kinder the second time. But it wasn't. It never was. And the digital display on the register blinked back at her with quiet indifference. $27.43. While her coins, her last coins, sat there in a sad, mismatched heap that suddenly felt much smaller than it had in her apartment 10 minutes ago when she'd poured them out onto the kitchen table under dim yellow light and told herself it would be enough this time. It had to be enough this time, because there wasn't anything else left to try. And behind her someone sighed loudly, the kind of sigh meant to be heard, the kind that carried judgment without needing words, followed by the faint shuffle of impatience as the line shifted and tightened, pressing closer, making the air around her feel thinner, heavier, harder to breathe, and Olivia swallowed, her fingers moving quickly now as she tried to organize the coins into neat stacks, her hands still shaking, her nails catching on the cold metal edges, counting under her breath again, even though she already knew the outcome, even though the number hadn't changed the first time, and it wouldn't change now. But she couldn't stop herself because stopping meant accepting it, and accepting it meant walking away empty-handed, and she couldn't do that. Not today, not when Emma had cried for nearly an hour last night, her tiny body restless, rejecting the cheaper formula Olivia had been forced to buy last week, the pediatrician's words echoing in her head over and over. Some babies are sensitive. You may need to switch brands. As if switching brands was as simple as switching lanes in traffic. As if it didn't mean choosing between rent and food and electricity and now this. Always this. Always another cost she couldn't afford, but couldn't ignore either, because Emma came first. Emma always came first, and Olivia's grip tightened around the can of formula resting on the counter, her thumb pressing into the label like she could anchor herself to it. Like letting go even for a second might mean losing it altogether, and she leaned slightly toward the cashier, her voice dropping lower, almost apologetic. I'm sorry. I just need a second. But the cashier's polite smile had already begun to fade into something more neutral, more practiced, the kind of expression that didn't invite conversation or sympathy, just efficiency. And somewhere behind Olivia a man muttered something under his breath, too quiet to make out, but loud enough to sting, and heat crept up her neck, settling in her cheeks. The familiar burn of humiliation she had learned to swallow, to survive, to pretend didn't bother her even as it clawed at her from the inside. And she forced herself to keep counting, one coin at a time, the sound of metal against laminate echoing in her ears, louder now than anything else, louder than the shifting line, louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights above, louder than her own thoughts, until for a split second she almost didn't notice the presence behind her, tall, still, silent, someone who hadn't sighed or shifted or complained, someone who hadn't moved at all, and though she didn't turn, didn't dare meet another stranger's eyes, she could feel it, the weight of attention that wasn't impatient but focused, deliberate, as if he was watching not just the scene but her, studying the way her hands trembled, the way her shoulders stayed square despite everything, the way she refused to step aside, even when it would have been easier, even when it would have spared her this moment. And Olivia exhaled slowly, gathering the last few coins into a small pile, her voice barely audible now as she said, almost to herself, "It's for my baby, she needs this one." Like saying it out loud might make it matter more, might make the gap between what she had and what she needed somehow smaller. But the number on the screen didn't change, and neither did the distance between desperation and relief. And for the first time since she stepped up to the counter, Olivia felt the quiet, terrifying possibility that even everything she had left still wasn't enough. The cashier's fingers moved over the coins with mechanical precision, stacking and recounting them faster than Olivia ever could, the soft clicks echoing like a countdown she could not stop. and when the final coin was placed down, the woman glanced at the register again before lifting her eyes, not unkind, but no longer patient either, and said quietly, "You are $3.18 short." And the words landed heavier than they should have, heavier than numbers, heavier than change. Because Olivia felt them settle deep in her chest as confirmation of what she had already feared, that even after giving everything she had left, it still was not enough, and for a second she did not move, did not breathe, her fingers still resting against the edge of the counter, as if letting go would mean losing the last fragile piece of control she had. And behind her the line shifted again, closer now, tighter, someone clearing their throat, another voice whispering something about being late, and Olivia forced herself to nod, a small, almost invisible motion, her throat tightening as she spoke. "It is okay. I will take the smaller one." Even though she knew the smaller one was the wrong one. The one that made Emma cry until her tiny face turned red and her body curled in discomfort. The one Olivia had sworn she would not buy again. But promises did not matter when reality stepped in, and slowly, carefully, she reached for the can on the counter, her grip loosening as she prepared to slide it back, her chest tightening with each inch it moved away from her, like she was physically pulling relief. Out of reach. And in that moment, she hated how familiar this feeling was, the quiet surrender, the constant calculation of what she could live without and what she could not, because there was always something that had to be sacrificed, always something that did not make it to the other side of the decision. And today it was this. Today it was the one thing her baby actually needed, and she swallowed hard, blinking quickly as the bright lights above blurred for just a second. But she did not let the tears fall. She could not afford that either. Not here, not now. And just as the can slid halfway across the counter, a voice from behind her cut through the tension, calm and steady, not loud but impossible to ignore. "Wait." And Olivia froze instantly, her hand stopping mid-motion, her breath catching again as the single word settled over the moment. Different from the impatience she had been bracing for, different from the irritation she expected, and before she could turn, before she could even process what was happening, the same voice spoke again, closer now, controlled but carrying a weight that shifted the entire atmosphere around them, added to mine. And there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, as if the world itself needed a second to adjust to what had just been said, and Olivia felt her pulse spike, confusion mixing with disbelief as she slowly turned her head, her eyes lifting just enough to catch a glimpse of the man who had been standing behind her all along, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked out of place in the small store, his presence sharp and defined against the ordinary background. And for a moment she did not understand why he would do that, why anyone would do that, because kindness like that did not just happen, not without reason, not without expectation, and instinctively she shook her head, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "No, I cannot. I cannot accept that." Her fingers tightening again around the edge of the counter as if grounding herself. But the man did not argue, did not push. He simply looked at the cashier and repeated, more firmly this time, "Add it to mine." As he reached into his wallet, his movements smooth, unhurried, as if this decision required no effort at all, and Olivia's heart pounded louder now, her thoughts racing between relief and resistance, because part of her wanted to accept, needed to accept, but another part refused to take something she had not earned, refused to owe a stranger anything more than a quiet thank you. And yet as she stood there, caught between those two instincts, she could feel something shifting in the space around her, something she could not quite name, because the man behind her was not looking at the situation the way everyone else had. He was not seeing inconvenience or delay or embarrassment. He was looking at her, and there was something in that gaze that made her feel exposed in a way she was not prepared for, like he was noticing details she had tried so hard to hide, like the exhaustion in her posture, the tension in her voice, the quiet desperation she had failed to mask. And as the cashier hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding and reaching for the register, Olivia realized that the moment she had been trying to survive alone was no longer entirely hers, and she did not know yet if that made things better or more complicated. Olivia's hand tightened around the edge of the counter as the cashier completed the transaction with the man's card. The soft electronic beep of approval sounding almost surreal to her ears, like it belonged to someone else's life, not hers. And for a moment she simply stood there, unmoving, watching as the can of formula was placed gently into a plastic bag and slid toward her. The same item she had just been seconds away from giving up, now suddenly within reach again, and yet instead of relief washing over her immediately, there was hesitation, a quiet resistance that rooted her in place, because nothing in her experience had ever been this simple. Nothing had ever been given without a cost she did not see coming at first, and slowly she turned to face him fully, her eyes lifting just enough to meet his for the first time. And what she found there was not impatience or expectation, but something far more unsettling. A calm, steady focus that made her feel like he was not just helping out of convenience, but because he had chosen to, deliberately, and that made it harder to accept, not easier. I said I cannot take this, she repeated, her voice firmer now despite the exhaustion woven through it. But the man did not react the way she expected. He did not argue or dismiss her concern. Instead, he simply studied her for a brief second longer before speaking, his tone low and measured. You are not taking anything. You are letting someone help. And the distinction caught her off guard, because it shifted the meaning of the moment in a way she was not prepared for. And before she could respond, the cashier placed the bag into her hands, the weight of it light but significant, and instinctively Olivia held it close, her fingers curling around the plastic as if afraid it might disappear again if she did not. And she swallowed, forcing herself to speak. I will pay you back. The words coming out quickly, almost automatically, because that was the only way she knew how to accept something like this. By turning it into a debt, something she could eventually balance, something that would not leave her feeling exposed. But the man shook his head slightly, his expression unchanged. That is not necessary, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no negotiation, just certainty. And that unsettled her even more, because if he did not want anything in return, then what was this? What was the reason? And for a moment she searched his face again, trying to find some clue, some explanation that made sense. But instead she found herself noticing details she had missed before. The precision of his posture, the quiet authority in the way he stood, the subtle familiarity in his features that she could not quite place, like a memory sitting just out of reach. And her heart skipped slightly at that realization, not because she recognized him, but because she felt like she should, and that thought alone made her uneasy. Why are you doing this? She asked finally, her voice softer now, not defensive but cautious, and for a brief second something shifted in his expression, something almost imperceptible, like a reaction he chose not to fully reveal. Before he answered, because I can, and it was such a simple response, so straightforward that it left no room for further questions, and yet it did not satisfy the one forming in the back of her mind, the one she could not quite put into words yet. And as she stood there holding the bag, the store around them seemed to return to motion, the line behind her beginning to move again, conversations resuming, the moment dissolving for everyone else as if it had never mattered. But for Olivia it lingered, heavy and unresolved. Because even as she stepped away from the counter, even as she murmured a quiet, thank you, that felt far too small for what had just happened, she could not shake the feeling that this was not the end of the interaction, not a simple act of kindness that would fade once she walked out the door, but the beginning of something she did not yet understand, something that had already started shifting the direction of her day in ways she could not control. And as she turned toward the exit, her grip tightening around the bag, she became acutely aware of his presence again behind her. Not distant, not detached, but following, not in a threatening way, but in a deliberate one, as if he was not quite ready to let the moment end. And for reasons she could not explain, that realization made her pulse quicken again, because it meant whatever this was, it was not over yet. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss as Olivia stepped out into the late afternoon air, the cool breeze brushing against her face in a way that should have felt relieving but did not quite reach the tension still coiled inside her chest. And she tightened her grip on the plastic bag, her fingers pressing into it, as if grounding herself in something real, something she could hold on to. Because everything about the last few minutes still felt slightly unreal, like a moment borrowed from someone else's life. and she moved quickly down the sidewalk, her steps purposeful, almost rushed, as if putting distance between herself and the store might somehow restore a sense of normalcy, might allow her to convince herself that this had just been a brief, isolated interaction, nothing more. But even as she walked, she could feel it, the awareness that had settled in her instincts before she consciously acknowledged it, the presence behind her still there, still matching her pace without urgency yet without hesitation. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders tightening just slightly as she told herself not to jump to conclusions, not to assume anything beyond what she had seen. And yet something about the way he had followed her out, without announcement, without explanation, made it impossible to ignore. And after a few more steps she slowed, just enough to confirm it, just enough to allow the distance between them to close. And when she finally stopped near the edge of the parking lot, she turned, her expression composed but guarded, her voice steady despite the undercurrent of unease. "You do not have to follow me." And the words were not accusatory, not sharp, but clear enough to draw a boundary. And for a brief moment he simply stood there, a few feet away, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, as if he had expected this, as if he had been waiting for her to acknowledge him directly. And when he spoke, his tone remained calm, unchanged from before. "I was not following you," he said, though the statement was not defensive, not dismissive, just stated as fact. And Olivia's brows knit slightly, because the answer did not quite match the situation, did not fully explain his presence here, outside, away from the context of the store. And before she could respond, he added, "You are walking too fast to make it home comfortably." And the observation caught her off guard, not because it was incorrect, but because it revealed something she had not expected him to notice. And she instinctively glanced down the street, calculating the distance in her mind, 15 blocks, maybe a little more, depending on the route, a distance she had walked many times before without complaint, but today felt heavier somehow, more urgent, more pressing, because of the call she had not yet received, but somehow felt coming, the constant low-level worry that had become part of her daily rhythm. And she shook her head slightly, pushing the thought aside. "I am fine," she replied, a little too quickly, her grip tightening again around the bag. But he did not move, did not leave. Instead, his gaze lingered on her for a second longer before shifting briefly to the bag in her hands, then back to her face, as if measuring something she could not see. And there was a pause, quiet but intentional, before he spoke again. "How old is your baby?" And the question landed differently than the others, softer in tone but heavier in implication, because it was not about the moment anymore. It was about her life beyond this brief encounter. And Olivia hesitated, her instinct telling her to deflect, to keep the boundary intact, because answering meant opening a door she had spent a long time keeping closed. But something in the way he asked, not intrusive, not demanding, but genuinely focused, made it harder to dismiss outright. And after a brief second she answered, cautiously, 6 months. And as soon as the words left her mouth, she felt a subtle shift in the air between them, something almost imperceptible but undeniably present, like a piece of information clicking into place for him, like confirmation of something he had already been considering. And though his expression remained controlled, she noticed it, the slight tightening in his jaw, the way his gaze sharpened just enough to suggest recognition, not of her exactly, but of something connected to her, something she did not yet understand. And that realization sent a quiet ripple of unease through her, because whatever this was, it was no longer just about a stranger helping at a store. It was becoming something else, something layered, something that reached beyond the surface of the moment. And for the first time since stepping outside, Olivia felt the unmistakable sense that she was no longer the only one trying to figure out what was happening, because the man in front of her was not guessing. He was connecting pieces, and she had no idea yet what picture he was starting to see. Olivia felt the weight of his question linger even after she answered, the word 6 months still echoing faintly in her mind, as if it had carried more meaning than she intended. And she shifted slightly where she stood, adjusting her grip on the bag, her instincts urging her to move, to leave, to regain control of the situation before it slipped further out of her hands. Because something about the way he looked at her now was different, more focused, more certain, and she did not like that. She did not like feeling seen in ways she could not predict. "I should go," she said quietly, her voice steady but final, turning slightly as if to continue down the sidewalk. But before she could take more than a step, he spoke again. Not louder, not forceful, but precise enough to stop her without needing to raise his voice. "Does she have a fever?" And the question hit her instantly, sharper than anything he had said before, because it was not random, it was not general, it was specific, too specific, and Olivia turned back toward him, her brows pulling together in confusion, her heart giving a small, uncertain beat as she searched his face, trying to understand where that question had come from. And for a second she said nothing, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them making sense, because she had not mentioned anything about Emma being sick, not today, not to him, not to anyone here. And yet the concern in his voice did not sound like a guess. It sounded like a conclusion, and she felt it then, the shift from unease into something deeper, something closer to alarm, not fear of danger, but fear of understanding, the kind that comes when something does not add up, when pieces begin to connect in ways you did not expect. "Why would you ask that?" she said, slowly, her tone cautious now, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she studied him more carefully. And for the first time since they stepped outside, he did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze held hers, steady and unwavering, as if weighing how much to say, how much to reveal. And in that brief silence, Olivia became acutely aware of every small detail around her, the distant hum of cars passing on the street, the faint rustle of wind moving through the trees lining the sidewalk, the subtle tension in her own shoulders as she waited. And then he exhaled softly, not in frustration but in decision. "Because you are holding that bag like it is the only thing that matters right now," he said, his voice even. "And because you said you needed that specific formula," he added, his eyes briefly flicking to the bag before returning to her face. "People do not fight that hard for something unless it is urgent." And the explanation was logical, grounded, and yet it did not fully settle the unease rising in her chest, because it still felt like he was seeing too much, reading too deeply into things she had not intended to reveal, and she hesitated, her first instinct still telling her to deny, to brush it off, to keep the boundary intact. But something in his reasoning made it harder to dismiss, because he was not wrong, and she could not ignore the truth in it, not when it matched the worry that had been sitting quietly in the back of her mind all afternoon. The memory of Emma's restless cries earlier, the way her small body had felt warmer than usual when Olivia left, trusting her neighbor to keep an eye on her for a few hours, trusting that everything would be fine, because it had to be fine, because she did not have another option. And Olivia's grip tightened again around the bag, her fingers pressing into the plastic as she swallowed, the resistance in her posture softening just slightly as reality pressed in. And finally, she gave a small, almost reluctant nod. "She was warm when I left," she admitted, her voice lower now, more honest than she intended. And the moment the words left her mouth, she saw it, the subtle shift in his expression again, not shock, not surprise, but confirmation, like another piece had fallen into place for him. And that realization sent a quiet chill through her, because whatever he was seeing, whatever he was putting together, it was moving faster than she could keep up with. And for the first time since this started, Olivia felt like she was no longer just reacting to the moment. She was being pulled into something she did not fully understand, something that was already beginning to take shape around her, and she did not know yet if she should step away from it or follow it to find out where it led. The admission seemed to settle between them with a weight Olivia could not ignore, her words lingering in the air longer than she wanted, and for a brief second she regretted saying anything at all, because now it felt like she had given him something real, something he could act on, and she was not sure she was ready for that, not from a stranger, not from someone who was already seeing too much. And she drew in a quiet breath, preparing to step away again, to end the conversation before it went any further. But before she could move, the sharp sound of her phone ringing cut through the moment, sudden and urgent, and her heart jumped instantly, her hand fumbling slightly as she reached into her pocket, because there was only one reason someone would call her at this time. Only one reason that tone would feel like this, and when she saw the name on the screen, her chest tightened immediately. "Mrs. Langley," she whispered under her breath, her pulse quickening as she answered without hesitation, "Hello." And the voice on the other end came fast, slightly strained, the kind of controlled urgency that made everything else fade into the background. "Olivia, I did not want to worry you, but Emma is running a fever. It is higher than before, and she is not settling down." And the words hit her all at once, sending a wave of cold panic through her body that replaced every other thought in an instant. And Olivia turned away slightly, her free hand gripping the bag tighter as if anchoring herself. "How high?" she asked quickly, her voice already tightening with concern, and there was a brief pause. Before the answer came, "It is just over 102, and that number was enough to send her heart racing, because it was no longer just warmth, no longer something she could brush off or monitor. It was something that needed attention now, and Olivia closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing herself to stay calm, to think clearly. "I am on my way," she said quickly, already shifting her weight as if she could will herself closer to home faster. And as she ended the call, the world seemed to sharpen around her, every second suddenly more important, every delay more costly, and she turned back toward the street, her steps already starting to move before she fully registered the distance. Ahead of her, the long stretch of blocks she would have to cover, the time it would take, time she did not have, not when Emma needed her. And for a split second she considered her options, the bus schedule she had memorized, the cost of a taxi she could not afford, the reality pressing in from every angle, and she felt it then, the familiar edge of helplessness creeping in, the same feeling she had fought at the counter just minutes ago. But this time it was sharper, more urgent, because it was not about money anymore. It was about time, and before she could take another step, his voice came again, closer now, firmer than before but still controlled. "You are not walking." And Olivia turned toward him instinctively, her expression a mix of urgency and resistance, because she did not have time to argue, did not have time to explain. "I do not have a choice," she replied quickly, already shifting her body as if to move past him, but he did not step aside, not in a way that blocked her, but in a way that held her attention, that forced her to pause just long enough to hear him. "Yes, you do," he said, his gaze steady, unwavering, and for a brief second she hesitated, caught between the need to move and the weight of his certainty, and then he gestured subtly toward the parking lot behind them, where a sleek black car sat waiting. Understated but unmistakably expensive, its presence quiet yet commanding. "I will drive you," he added, and the offer hung there, simple in words but heavy in implication, because it was not just about getting her home faster. It was about trusting him, about stepping into something she did not fully understand, and Olivia's instinct reacted immediately, caution rising to the surface, because everything in her life had taught her to be careful, to question, to protect what little she had left, and yet the image of Emma, small and flushed with fever, pushed against that instinct with equal force, and for a moment she stood there, caught between those two opposing pulls, the need to protect herself and the need to reach her child as quickly as possible, and her fingers tightened around the bag once more as she looked at him, really looked. This time, searching for something she could trust, something she could hold on to in this decision, and what she found was not pressure, not expectation, but quiet certainty, the kind that did not demand but simply existed, and that made the choice both easier and more complicated at the same time, because it meant the decision was entirely hers, and the consequences of it would be too. Olivia's gaze lingered on the car for only a second, but it felt longer, stretched by the urgency pounding in her chest, and the image of Emma growing sharper in her mind with every passing moment. Her small face flushed, her breathing uneven, and that was enough to tip the balance, enough to push her past hesitation and into action, because whatever questions she had about this man, whatever uncertainty still lingered, none of it mattered more than getting to her child, and without allowing herself another second to reconsider, she nodded once, short and decisive. "Okay," she said, the word coming out faster than she expected, almost like she had been holding it back. And he did not respond with surprise or relief. He simply turned and moved toward the car, his pace steady, purposeful, as if this outcome had always been the most likely one, and Olivia followed, her steps quick now, matching his direction without fully thinking about it, the bag still clutched tightly in her hand. as she reached the passenger side just as he unlocked the doors with a quiet click, and for a brief second she hesitated again, her hand hovering near the handle, because stepping into the car felt like crossing an invisible line, like committing to something she did not fully understand. But then she thought of the distance again, the time it would take on foot, and she pushed the door open, sliding into the seat with a small exhale as the interior enclosed around her, the soft leather and subtle scent of the car immediately contrasting with the tension she carried. And before she could fully process the shift, he was already in the driver's seat, the engine starting smoothly as he pulled out of the parking space without unnecessary movement, his focus entirely on the road ahead. And for a moment there was silence, not uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken thoughts. Olivia staring forward, her fingers tightening and loosening around the bag as she tried to steady her breathing, while beside her, he drove with quiet precision, his posture relaxed but controlled, and after a few seconds he spoke, his tone even. "Where do you live?" And she answered quickly, giving directions without hesitation, her voice more urgent now, the words coming faster as if speed alone could shorten the distance. And he nodded once, adjusting their route without question, the car accelerating slightly as they merged onto the main road. And Olivia felt the movement immediately, the shift from stillness to motion, from waiting to doing something, anything, and it brought a small, fragile sense of relief, because at least now she was moving toward Emma instead of away from her. And she glanced at the clock on the dashboard, calculating time in her head, each minute stretching, each second carrying weight. And then her phone buzzed again in her hand, a message this time, and she glanced down quickly, her heart tightening as she read the short update from Mrs. Langley. "She is still warm. I am keeping her comfortable." And Olivia exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just slightly, not because the situation had improved, but because it had not gotten worse yet, and she typed a quick response, her fingers moving fast, before locking the screen again. And when she looked up, she caught him watching her for just a fraction of a second before his attention returned to the road. And something about that brief glance made her speak without fully deciding to. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice softer now, less defensive, more genuine, because regardless of everything else, he had made this possible. He had given her time she would not have had otherwise, and he acknowledged it with a small nod, nothing more, as if the gratitude was expected but not necessary. And for a moment she studied him again, really looked this time, the strong line of his profile, the calm focus in his expression, the subtle familiarity that still lingered at the edges of her thoughts, and it bothered her now more than before, because it felt like she was missing something important, something she should recognize but could not quite grasp, and she hesitated before asking, her voice careful, "Do I know you?" And the question hung between them, simple on the surface but carrying a deeper weight underneath, because it was not just curiosity anymore. It was a need to understand why this felt the way it did, why this moment felt less like coincidence and more like something that had been building toward this point without her realizing it. And for a brief second he did not answer, his eyes remaining on the road as if considering how to respond. And then he spoke, his tone unchanged but quieter somehow, more deliberate. "You used to." And the words settled heavily in the space between them, not as a clear explanation but as the beginning of one. And Olivia felt her breath catch slightly, her mind immediately searching, reaching back through memories she had not revisited in a long time, trying to find a connection, a face, a moment that matched the man sitting beside her. And yet nothing came into focus right away, only fragments, impressions, things that felt close but not quite there. And as the car continued down the road, carrying them closer to her apartment, Olivia realized that whatever this connection was, whatever history existed between them, it was not something simple. And the answers she was looking for were not going to come easily. The words lingered in Olivia's mind longer than the silence that followed. "You used to," repeating over and over as if they were trying to unlock something buried just out of reach. And she stared ahead at the road but did not really see it, her thoughts turning inward, searching, pulling at fragments of memory that refused to fully form. Because there had been a time when her life looked completely different, a time before the apartment, before the constant calculations, before the quiet. Loneliness had settled into her routine, and somewhere in that past there had been people, faces, moments she had not thought about in years, and now one of them might be sitting beside her, driving her home as if this had always been part of the story, and she swallowed, her grip tightening again around the bag as the weight of that possibility pressed in. I do not remember, she admitted finally, her voice low, not defensive but uncertain, and for a brief second she wondered if that would change something. If he would explain, if he would fill in the gaps she could not reach on her own, but instead he simply nodded once, as if her answer was expected, as if it confirmed something he had already known, and that reaction unsettled her. More than anything else, because it meant this connection was not mutual, not equal. It meant he remembered something she did not, something important enough to recognize her now, and yet he was choosing not to say it outright, not yet, and that left her suspended in a space she could not control, a space where answers existed but were not being given. And the car continued moving steadily through the city, the streets shifting from busier intersections to quieter residential blocks, familiar landmarks beginning to appear, and Olivia felt the distance closing, each turn bringing her closer to the one place she needed to be. And just as she started to focus on that again, to push everything else aside, her phone buzzed once more in her hand, sharper this time, more urgent, and her heart jumped immediately as she unlocked the screen, her eyes scanning the message quickly. She is crying more now, and she feels hotter. And the words hit her harder than the call had, because they confirmed what she feared. That time was slipping, that every minute mattered more than she wanted to admit. And Olivia inhaled sharply, her voice tightening as she spoke without looking away from the screen. Please drive faster. And there was no hesitation in her tone now, no room for politeness or caution, just urgency. And beside her he responded immediately, not with words but with action, the car accelerating smoothly, his focus sharpening as he adjusted their route again, choosing the fastest path without question. And Olivia leaned back slightly, her free hand pressing against her forehead as she tried to steady herself, to keep her thoughts from spiraling too far ahead, because she needed to stay present, needed to be ready when she walked through that door. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the tension in the car shifting from uncertainty to urgency, from quiet observation to focused intent. And then, without warning, he broke the silence, his voice quieter now, but carrying a weight that made her look up instantly. You left the company without saying anything, he said, and the statement caught her off guard, pulling her attention away from the immediate concern just long enough to register what he had said, because it was not a question, it was a fact, something specific, something tied to a version of her life she had not revisited in a long time. And Olivia turned toward him slightly, her brows knitting together as the pieces shifted again, because that was something only someone from her past would know, something tied to a time when she had been someone else entirely. And her voice came out slower this time, more cautious. What company? She asked, even though a part of her already knew the answer, already felt the shape of it forming in her mind. And for the first time since they got into the car, he glanced at her fully, not just a quick look, but a direct one, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying something deeper, something that confirmed what she had been starting to suspect. And when he spoke, the name landed with quiet certainty, Hayes Group. And the moment those words reached her, something inside Olivia shifted sharply, the fragments finally aligning just enough to create a clearer image, the late nights, the office floors, the meetings she had once been part of, the career she had built and then left behind without explanation. And her breath caught slightly as realization began to settle in, not fully formed yet, but undeniable. And as the car turned onto her street, the distance closing completely, Olivia realized that the situation unfolding around her was no longer just about getting home in time. It was about understanding a past she had tried to leave behind, a past that had somehow found its way back to her at the exact moment she needed it most. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the Warren apartment building just as Olivia was already reaching for the door handle, her movements quick, almost urgent. The moment the vehicle fully halted, she pushed the door open and stepped out without waiting, her breath catching slightly as she looked up at the familiar structure, the chipped paint, the dim hallway light visible through the entrance. Everything exactly the same as she had left it, yet now carrying a new weight because of what was waiting inside. And she turned back for only a second, her voice rushed but sincere. Thank you. before she moved toward the entrance, her steps fast, almost breaking into a run as she pushed the door open and disappeared inside, leaving the quiet hum of the engine and the man behind her. And the moment she entered the hallway, the air shifted, warmer, heavier, filled with the faint sounds of movement from upstairs, and she took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding harder with each step, her mind focused on one thing only, Emma. And when she reached her apartment door, her hand fumbled slightly with the keys, the seconds stretching painfully before the lock finally turned, and she pushed the door open, stepping inside to find Mrs. Langley already standing in the small living room, gently rocking the baby in her arms, her expression a mix of concern and relief. "She has been crying on and off," she said softly as Olivia crossed the room quickly, reaching out without hesitation. And the moment Emma was placed in her arms, everything else fell away, the world narrowing down to the small, warm weight against her chest, the faint whimpering sound, the heat she could feel immediately through the thin fabric, and Olivia's heart tightened as she pulled her closer, her voice soft, steady despite the fear underneath. "I am here. It is okay." And for a moment she simply stood there, holding her child, grounding herself in that connection, that responsibility, before she moved toward the couch, sitting down carefully as she adjusted Emma in her arms, checking her forehead again, feeling the warmth that had not gone down, and behind her, Mrs. Langley spoke again. "I was about to suggest calling someone," and Olivia nodded slightly, her mind already racing through options, pediatrician, urgent care, what she could afford, what she could not. The same calculations returning, but now under pressure, and she inhaled slowly, trying to steady her thoughts, trying to decide the next step, when there was a soft knock at the door, unexpected but not entirely surprising, and Olivia looked up, her gaze shifting toward the entrance as Mrs. Langley moved to open it, revealing him standing there, composed as before, as if he had simply followed the moment to its natural conclusion. And for a brief second Olivia felt that same tension return, the overlap between two worlds she had been trying to keep separate, but now they were colliding in her living room, and he stepped inside only when Mrs. Langley moved aside, his presence filling the small space in a way that felt both out of place and oddly fitting, his gaze immediately settling on the child in Olivia's arms, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but focused, attentive, and, after a brief pause, he spoke, his voice lower now, carrying something more personal than before. "Let me see her." And Olivia hesitated, her instinct tightening for a second, but then she shifted slightly, allowing him a closer look without fully handing Emma over. And he stepped closer, his attention narrowing, his expression changing almost imperceptibly as he took in the small details, the flushed cheeks, the soft movements, the quiet sounds, and for a moment the room fell silent again, the weight of everything settling into that single point. And then he exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting from the baby to Olivia, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that cut through everything else. "She needs to be seen by a doctor tonight." And Olivia nodded immediately, the answer already forming in her mind. But before she could respond, before she could say anything more, he added something that made her pause, made her breath catch slightly as the meaning began to settle in. "I already called ahead," he said, and her eyes widened just enough to show the shift, the realization that he had acted before she had even asked, before she had even decided, and she stared at him. For a brief second, her thoughts racing to catch up, to understand how he had known, how he had anticipated this step, and as that question formed in her mind, he looked at her steadily and spoke again, the words quiet but unmistakable. "Olivia, why did you not tell me?" And the way he said her name, the way he held her gaze, carried something deeper than the moment itself, something tied to everything she had been trying to piece together. And then he added, just enough to shift everything completely. "Emma deserves better than this." And the room seemed to still around them as the realization hit, because she had never told him her daughter's name, not once, not in the store, not in the car, not here, and yet he had said it with certainty, like it was not new information, but something he had always known. And in that moment Olivia understood that whatever connection existed between them, whatever past he remembered and she did not, it was no longer something distant or unclear. It was here, standing in front of her, changing everything she thought she knew.